It is Monday, April 1st. Thanks for joining us for a brand new month here on the Mo.news podcast. I'm Moshe Wanunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. And we'll probably be spending the day, Jill, over on Instagram telling you what the actual news is today, given that it is April Fool's Day. And some companies and people are looking to play a fast one on you today.
Yeah, so if it seems like too good to be true or too weird to be true, it's probably not true.
Though we should also note, Jill, in reality, today also begins a new period of Mercury in retrograde, if you believe in that. So some of you might be like, well, maybe it's just Mercury in retrograde, but it's also April Fool's Day. So just beware before you reshare things, before you retweet anything. And, you know, a bunch of brands will come out with things. I think recently 7-Eleven already got ahead of the game saying they're putting out hot dog water, 7-Eleven hot dog water. That's an April Fool's joke. That is not real. So we're already getting rolling here with various companies having fun with you today.
Moshe, I thought you were going to say 7-Eleven's prank when they said that they were going to introduce a tiny gulp instead of a big gulp, just 0.7 ounces. So they said it's the perfect little sip.
Listen, in some cases, you're like, man, that might be something a company might do. But again, just double check it today. I think Del Taco's already said they were putting out hot sauce Tic Tacs. That's also fake news. And Adidas is having fun. As opposed to shoes coming in boxes, they say they have a box shoe, like literally a shoe shaped like a box. That is also an April Fool's joke.
Elon Musk put out a tweet that said Tesla goes bankrupt.
By the way, like we live in a reality now where crazy stuff happens, where like stuff is believable. Anyway, just a heads up, it is April Fool's Day, so be on the lookout.
Okay, now to the actual headlines here. The funeral for fallen police officer Jonathan Diller has opened up a new debate about repeat offenders and bail reform in New York State and across the country. The cleanup begins in Baltimore after last week's bridge collapse as a debate starts in D.C. over funding a new bridge. And we're learning more about the lack of protection for other major bridges in the United States. In foreign news, we'll bring you the latest on the investigation into the stabbing of an Iranian TV anchor in London. The Iranian government is the prime suspect. In business news, AT&T customers beware. We'll tell you about the latest data breach revelation from the company. In politics, Transgender Visibility Day fell on Easter this year, and Republicans and Democrats went back and forth over it. An iconic piece from the Titanic movie up for auction, the door that saved Rose, but not Jack. We asked the Mo News community what piece of memorabilia they would want to bid on.
Jill, my favorite, someone wants the watermelon from Dirty Dancing, if it still exists.
And an update on the men's and women's Final Four, a big game tonight.
Yes, LSU versus Iowa, Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese. We'll tell you more about that matchup.
And Moshe is on this day in history.
Yes, we will tell you things that actually took place, Jill, on April 1st, including Gmail, which came out on this day 20 years ago, Jill, and many people internally at Google thought that was an April Fool's prank because it turned out the Google founders were playing a lot of pranks around that.
All right, let's start with the funeral of fallen NYPD officer Jonathan Diller this weekend. Thousands of police officers from across the New York region attended to honor Diller, as friends, family, and colleagues gathered to remember him at a funeral on Saturday morning at a Catholic church on Long Island. Diller was fatally shot in the line of duty last week in a killing that has become a political flashpoint. Diller and his partner were investigating an illegally parked SUV when a passenger in that car, Guy Rivera, shot Diller below his ballistic vest. Diller's partner returned fire, wounding Rivera. New York City Mayor Eric Adams said at the funeral that even after he had been shot, Diller fought back and disarmed Rivera. Rivera had 21 prior arrests. He is now charged with first-degree murder and other crimes. And the driver of the SUV is charged with weapons offenses. New York City Mayor Adams, a former police captain, said a vast majority of New York City residents share our vision of holding criminals accountable and reducing gun violence. Among those who visited the wake this week were former President Trump, who has made crime a huge issue in his campaign, Also attending the wake Friday was the governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, a Democrat. She was there briefly and then was confronted by an attendee and then booed by some of the officers as she left. New York State policies like bail reform, which hold those accused of crimes and convicted of crimes for shorter sentences, have become a focus of attention. She was briefly there, and then she was confronted by an attendee. She was booed by some officers as she left. Hochul has been a supporter of bail reform in New York State. In some cases, that has lowered bail or meant no bail, and has also meant shorter sentences for people convicted of crimes. And in light of Diller's high-profile killing, the issue is now back in the spotlight. Diller's widow, Stephanie, delivered a powerful eulogy. And one thing that she said about not enough being done to protect police officers is getting a lot of attention. Let's take a listen.
My husband died a hero, but he also lived as one. Our world will never be the same, but I know I speak for everyone when I say I could not be more proud of him. It's been 2 years and 2 months since Detective Rivera and Detective Mora made the ultimate sacrifice, just like my husband, Jonathan Diller. Dominique Rivera stood in front of all the elected officials present today pleading for change. That change never came, and now my son will grow up without his father. I will grow old without my husband, and his parents have to say goodbye to their child. How many more police officers and how many more families need to make the ultimate sacrifice before we start protecting them? I don't wish this kind of pain on anyone. Jonathan lived his life doing good for people, and it's now time for people to do good for all the officers.
Jill, coming out of that, the headline front page of the New York Post was "How many more?" quoting Stephanie Diller there with her photo holding her 1-year-old son that Jonathan leaves behind. Diller is the first NYPD officer to be killed in the line of duty since 2022. That's when 2 officers were ambushed and killed in Harlem that year. Jason Rivera and Wilbert Mora were their names. But there has been a 20% rise in assaults on cops over the last 14 months, including a 72% rise in stabbings of police officers in New York City. Now, as you noted, the suspect here, Guy Rivera, had 21 prior arrests, mainly for drugs and assault. 9 of those arrests were for felonies. Jill, he actually had a shiv stuffed up his behind that they discovered upon arrest last week, anticipating that he might be returning to prison. Most recently, he served a 5-year prison term for drugs, was released in 2021, and went off parole last year. The suspicion last week is that he and another man, Lindy Jones, who was in the car with him, were casing various shops in order to conduct a robbery. Now, Jones, who was in the car with him, also has 14 prior arrests for things like robbery, assault, attempted murder back in 2001. He himself spent a decade behind bars and was most recently rearrested upon release last April with a loaded illegal gun. So he was set to appear in court this week on that charge and is facing additional charges as part of the murder of Officer Diller. Now, what's not clear right now as we talk about bail reform, legal changes, calls to do more, is what changes in the law could have prevented this, given that these two were not specifically out related to bail reform that was passed a couple years ago. And we are waiting for more specificity. In the past, the mayor has also said that more needs to be done on a federal level when it comes to guns, given the illegal guns that are coming into New York from other states. As far as bail reform and sentencing reform, that's something that really started to be discussed over the past decade. Critics say that it was a penalty for poverty, that low-income people of color are disproportionately impacted by bail laws, that your income should not determine how much time you spent in jail. And the U.S. spends about $14 billion a year holding people in jail before trial. So they called for reforms here, and it's not just New York, it's California, Chicago, a number of other cities across America. Many of those passed in the lead up and then in the fallout of the killing of George Floyd. As you watch the Black Lives Matter movement, the Defund the Police movement really take effect there. Bail reform has been a huge issue, and now there's been a lot of pushback that it's gone too far. Critics of bail reform say that a majority of crimes in places like New York are committed by repeat offenders, and the state needs to look into upping the penalties and keeping people in prison, especially if they've committed prior offenses, especially felonies. Jill, there's been a divide for a while now, especially in New York, between the mayor of New York and the governor of New York, both Democrats. But the mayor, again, a former police captain, Eric Adams, saying more needs to be done when it comes to crime, when it comes to prison sentences, et cetera. And so you do see this pushback after years where the bail reform advocates seem to be winning in a number of major American cities.
Yeah, I think in this case, it feels like it's the sentencing guidelines that perhaps could have impacted these people not being out on the streets. But as you said, not exactly clear. I will give you one quick story. A friend of mine was the victim of an attempted burglary at her house, and the police actually caught the person like red-handed. She had security cameras, and they were able to catch this person. So there was no doubt that he did it. And he was actually out on parole. So not probation, like he was literally on parole from another crime. And he had a rap sheet that was extremely long. And because of that, she was under the impression that he would spend a pretty lengthy time behind bars, which made her feel good. And he spent 10 days behind bars, and he's back out. And she spoke to police officers and attorneys about it, and they said it's the sentencing guidelines, and there was nothing that the judge could do, and so this was the situation. So that's just one story of many, and I know there's others. There's people who are wrongfully convicted, and so I don't want to totally get into the debate, but that's just one story of how it is impacting somebody that I personally know who would be sleeping a lot better at night if this person was not out on the streets and if this person was behind bars still.
Yeah, it seems like the pendulum swings here between justice reform and then those who want longer sentences. And, one of the big issues we face is the lack of reform that's conducted while folks are serving time behind bars and then check-ins afterwards to ensure they can be gainfully employed, et cetera. So this is a very complex matter. It's been the subject of long books, documentaries, theses, et cetera. But certainly in this case, the killing of Officer Diller is rekindling that debate here in New York.
All right, switching gears, teams of engineers worked Saturday on the intricate process of cutting and lifting the first section of twisted steel from the collapsed Francis Scott Key Bridge, which crumpled into Baltimore's Patapsco River this week after a massive cargo ship crashed into one of its supports. The largest crane on the eastern seaboard showed up over the weekend to help with the process. Maryland Governor Wes Moore on Sunday urged Republicans to work with Democrats to approve the federal funding needed for rebuilding the bridge and to get the port economy back on its feet. The Biden administration released $60 million in initial emergency aid on Thursday to assist in cleaning up the bridge debris and reopening the port, which is the largest in the U.S. for roll-on, roll-off vehicle imports, as they're called, and also exports of farm and construction equipment. The port has been closed since Tuesday, leaving the jobs of about 15,000 people in limbo who rely on its daily operations. Federal officials have told Maryland lawmakers that the final cost of rebuilding the bridge could soar to at least $2 billion. Biden has pledged that the federal government will cover the cost and then eventually recover the funds from the insurance companies and those held liable, but does not want to wait for that legal process while a vital bridge is not being rebuilt. Funds will depend on passage of legislation authorizing that money by Congress. So the Senate, which is controlled by Democrats, does not appear to be a problem. But the House, which still has a very, very slim Republican majority, is showing some signs that they may not be so quick to approve the funding. The Maryland governor said Republicans should be willing to approve the funding for the sake of not just the city of Baltimore, but for the national economy. Some conservatives in the House are already angry about the recent approval of a massive 2024 spending package. So they are pushing back against Biden's proposal, saying that the money should come out of other White House spending.
Yeah, and we should note that when the Minneapolis bridge collapse happened more than a decade ago, Congress approved funds within a week. It does not look like that'll be the case this time around. And we'll see if there becomes a huge tug of war here, a huge back and forth, but there are huge economic impacts here to getting this done. And it will take a long time to eventually recover the funds from the company, whether it's the cargo container company, the shipping company, the company that hired them, the insurance companies, et cetera. And they don't want to wait, given that it could be up to 7 years to rebuild the bridge here, according to estimates from engineers so far. Now, as this discussion takes place about rebuilding the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, Baltimore. The Wall Street Journal was out with an interesting story over the weekend looking at 8 major bridges across the U.S. that have the same clearance as the one in Baltimore, all really large, and also have the same vulnerability where the failure of even one single steel component in tension along the span could cause a collapse along the entire bridge. They include, here are the following 8 bridges they focused on: the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington, the Lewis and Clark Bridge that connects Oregon and Washington, the St. John's Bridge in Oregon, the Bay Bridge and the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco and Oakland, the GW Bridge and Verrazano Bridge connecting New Jersey, New York, and then Staten Island and Brooklyn, and the Chesapeake Bay Bridge in Maryland are the key bridges here that lack the barriers to stop a cargo container ship like this. Now, if you look at pictures of the key bridge before the collision, you see some sparsely placed barriers. They're called dolphins, actually, in front of the piers, and they're meant to take the brunt of a boat that's going into one of the columns, but they're not nearly the size, and there were certainly not enough at the FSK Bridge to stop a cargo ship the size of the Dolly. That's the ship that ended up hitting the bridge. So many bridges across the U.S. lack these basic protection systems, these barriers, these what are again called dolphins or fenders, and it's relatively cheap when you look at the cost of these bridges in the billions. You're talking about millions or tens of millions to create these barriers. Now, one thing I learned over the weekend was a lot of this emanates from a 1980 collapse back in Tampa Bay of the Sunshine Skyway Bridge when a freighter rammed into that bridge down in Florida. Federal guidelines were released after that that said that certain barriers need to be in place. But that doesn't apply to bridges built before 1991, which is a lot of bridges in this country. So some state and local authorities have taken it upon themselves to improve protection systems. That includes the Delaware Memorial Bridge. They're actually in the midst already of building about $20 million in new barriers. And it does come as cargo ships have become larger and larger and larger over time. Back when cargo ships first started, 70 years ago or so, they could carry about 58 containers. Today, they can carry about 24,000 20-foot containers. So these are massive ships, and so the barriers need to be made even larger. They're called mega fenders here. So that's something that the federal government is going to be looking at, according to the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, essentially retrofitting a lot of our major bridges that are near ports and have huge ships going near them. How do we increase their security? One thing that a number of ports use are tugboats. In this case, there was not a tugboat, but that, of course, raises costs. When you also put these fenders in place, that slows things down from a port, so that has costs as well. So they'll be looking at a lot of reforms here as, the focus is on FSK Bridge, but given that we have 10,000 plus bridges across the country near ports, a lot of discussion now about what needs to be done to prevent last week's tragedy in another place.
Time for the speed read from the Associated Press. British counterterrorism police are investigating the stabbing of an Iranian television presenter outside of his home in London as concern grows over threats to a Farsi language satellite news channel that has long been critical of Iran's government. Pouria Zarati was an anchor at London-based Iran International. He was stabbed in the leg Friday afternoon and is in stable condition at a hospital. London's Metropolitan Police Service said that Zarati's occupation, his job, together with recent threats to UK-based Iranian journalists, triggered the counterterrorism investigation. Police say they have disrupted a number of plots to kill or kidnap people in the UK who were seen as enemies of the Iranian government. Officers are working with intelligence agencies to disrupt future plots and provide protection for the targeted organizations and individuals.
Yeah, this is something we've seen from the Russian government, and we're seeing from the Iranian government, the targeting of dissidents or critics around the world. Early last year, Iran International, that's the network, temporarily shut down its operations in London, moved studios back to Washington, D.C., after what it described was an escalation of state-backed threats from Iran. The station resumed operations at a new location in London just a few months ago. Jill, I watched interviews with a couple folks who work for Iran International, and they are very concerned about this. They say there have been multiple foiled plots against both Perea and other employees at the network. Families have been threatened. One official saying the Iranian government means business here, but we're not going to let them stop us. Now, BBC Persian and Iran International have been declared terrorist channels by the Iranian government for saying critical things about the Iranian regime. Though they both insist the show must go on, was the quote from one of them over the weekend, despite the fact that the threats have escalated over the last 18 months. An Austrian man back in December was convicted of attempting to collect information for the Iranian government after security guards spotted him carrying out surveillance on the former headquarters of Iran International. And it comes as there was an interesting New York Times piece over the weekend about the killing of a Russian dissident in Spain. You know, the feeling from Putin, the Iranian regime, and in some cases the Chinese government that they can get away with this sort of thing around the world and have been carrying out these effectively these assassinations or assassination attempts on a number of people that have been critical of them, hoping, of course, to dissuade people to create fear of anyone abroad from criticizing them.
From the Hill, Republicans took aim at President Biden over the weekend for proclaiming Easter Sunday as the Transgender Day of Visibility. Although the 2 days only coincided this year by chance, the Transgender Day of Visibility was started 15 years ago, back in 2009, as a day of awareness to celebrate the success of transgender and gender nonconforming people. It is held annually on March 31st. The White House has put out a statement honoring the day since Biden got into office in 2021. The date of Easter, meanwhile, changes year to year between March and April. Again, this year, the 2 days, though, coincided, but several Republicans seized on Biden's annual proclamation to attack the president. Former President Trump's campaign saying in a statement, it is appalling and insulting that Joe Biden's White House formally proclaimed Easter Sunday as Trans Day of Visibility. House Speaker Mike Johnson said the Biden administration had, quote, betrayed the central tenet of Easter. Writing on X, he said the American people are taking note.
Yeah, so we should note the White House put out a statement honoring Easter. They also put out a statement for Transgender Visibility Day. And again, this is the first time the 2 days have coincided, but that didn't stop Republicans from attacking and calling it effectively a war on faith, etc. Some Republicans saying the White House shouldn't put a statement at all, given that it was a religious holiday, given how important Easter is. The White House replying that it can do both. And they added in their statement, quote, it's unsurprising politicians are seeking to divide and weaken our country with cruel, hateful, and dishonest rhetoric. President Biden will never abuse his faith for political purposes or for profit. They noted Biden, of course, a devout Catholic who was in church for Easter. In this year's proclamation for Transgender Day of Visibility, the president honored, quote, the extraordinary courage and contributions of transgender Americans. Jill, this has been a hot button issue for a couple years now. Jill, this has been a hot button issue for a couple years now when it comes to transgender rights and discrimination. And this is only the latest, but this got a lot of attention on social media over the weekend.
To business news from the New York Times, AT&T announced over the weekend that it had reset the passcodes of 7.6 million customers after it determined that compromised customer data was released on the dark web. The company said that information varied by customer and account, but that it may have included a person's full name, email address, mailing address, phone number, social security number, date of birth, AT&T account number, and passcode. AT&T said, quote, our internal teams are working with external cybersecurity experts to analyze the situation. To the best of our knowledge, the compromised data appears to be from 2019 or earlier and does not contain personal financial information or call history. In addition to those 7.6 million customers, 65.4 million former AT&T account holders were also affected.
Obviously concerning, Jill, given how much people can get from you between your social security number, date of birth, etc. What's also interesting is they mentioned that this is from 2019 or before, but AT&T right now is not addressing questions as to how the breach happened and why it went unnoticed for so long. It does come as AT&T did have that huge outage a couple of weeks back that affected yours truly, as I discussed here on the podcast. The company says it will be reaching out to individuals with compromised sensitive personal information, offering complimentary ID theft and credit monitoring services as part of the deal here. AT&T has reset the passcodes for those affected and directed customers to a site with details about how to reset them. themselves. It also says it's starting with a robust investigation by internal and external cybersecurity experts. They say they don't know whether the leaked data originated from AT&T or one of its vendors. So it's trying to get to the bottom of it. Again, it appears this theft happened at least 5 years ago.
From U.S. News and World Report, Puerto Rico has declared a dengue epidemic following a surge of cases in the mosquito-borne disease in the U.S. territory. In total, there have been 549 cases, including 341 hospitalizations and 29 severe cases since the start of this year. And infectious disease experts say the jump in cases is unusual because transmission of the virus in the drier months of winter is typically low. And he says the fact that it is happening now is really kind of a heads up, a warning sign for us. We are having introductions of the virus by people traveling, and we are seeing these outbreaks in Puerto Rico that are out of the season, which are really unusual.
We should note dengue is not a new problem for Puerto Rico. Over the last decade, there were more than 30,000 cases from 4 U.S. territories, with Puerto Rico reporting the most. Dengue is a disease that is most common in tropical and subtropical climates. It can cause a high fever, severe headache, joint and muscle pain, a rash, and in some very severe cases, it can cause death. According to the CDC, about 1 in 4 people who get infected with dengue develop symptoms, and 1 in 20 develop severe illness. Public health experts say that surges like the latest one in Puerto Rico are likely to become more common as there's increased international travel. Have seen some warnings from the state of Florida to be on the lookout as well for the mosquito-borne illness. As far as symptoms here, they say they appear between 3 to 14 days after the bite and can include a sudden fever, severe headache, eye pain, and sometimes some even more severe symptoms.
From NPR, some of the most iconic props in Hollywood history hit the auction block last week, from Indiana Jones's trusty whip to Forrest Gump's chocolates to the infamous axe from The Shining. But the top-selling item was a piece of debris, albeit one that has stirred imagination and debate for a quarter century. It is the wood panel from Titanic that saved Rose, but controversially, not Jack. That was the king of the auction, with the winning bid at just under $720,000. According to Heritage Auctions, the bidding started at $60,000.
So a lot of back and forth there, Jill.
Yes, it must have been a fun auction. It's actually called Hero Floating Wood Panel, which did play an iconic role in the 1997 Titanic blockbuster. As the ship sunk, stranding passengers in the frigid waters of the Atlantic Ocean, Kate Winslet's character Rose manages to lie afloat on the piece of a door, while Leonardo DiCaprio's Jack clings to the edge, eventually succumbing to hypothermia.
Sorry to those who haven't seen Titanic by now, but we figured we'll blow the ending for you at this point. It's been 30 years.
Yeah, do you have to issue a spoiler alert when it's been more than 2 decades? Several other Titanic items also got large bids, including the ship's helm wheel that went for $200,000, Rose's waterlogged dress that went for over $118,000, and the ship's brass engine order telegraph, which went for $81,000.
Yeah, unclear if one person bought a bunch of those and is just creating a Titanic replica in their home. Now, Jill, as far as the Hero Floating Wood Panel, I think we've told you about this debate before, but it's been a hot topic for a while as to whether Rose could have actually saved Jack, given how large the wood panel was. James Cameron, the director of the film, says he has made clear in multiple interviews that there was no way Rose could have saved Jack, that Jack tries to get on the raft, but it kind of flips. So there's not enough buoyancy for 2 people, only for 1 person. So he makes the decision to let her be that person. But if you caught an episode of Mythbusters a few years ago, they teamed up with James Cameron to actually tackle the question, could that wood panel have saved both of them? They actually concluded in Mythbusters that Rose and Jack could have stayed afloat and avoided hypothermia if they tied her life jacket underneath to help the buoyancy of the wood panel. Now, James Cameron said 5 years later that he loved working on the show, but they're full of shit.
Apparently, Cameron funded his own investigation into this, where they reenacted it like in the ocean, and they found that no, Jack could not have fit. But some have said that his investigation could have been biased because he made the film and obviously wanted it to be realistic. Yeah,
and he said that, listen, according to the plot, Jack's supposed to die. So what do you want me to do here? That's the film. Now, as far as movie memorabilia, that you would like to own. Jill, we put that question to the Mo News audience on Instagram on Friday. I got thousands of answers. Among the most popular, the lamp from Christmas Story, the boombox from Say Anything. Again, if these were up for auction and money was no object, these are things people would bid on. The Wilson the volleyball from the Tom Hanks film, the Ruby Red Slippers, Dorothy's Ruby Red Slippers, very popular, Burn Book from Mean Girls, the hockey stick putter from Happy Gilmore, the model school for kids who can't read good from New Zoolander, the briefcase from Pulp Fiction, and as I mentioned earlier, my favorite, the watermelon from Dirty Dancing. Unclear whether they used an actual watermelon or a fake watermelon in that film, because I would say if it was real, I don't know what the looks of a 40-year-old watermelon would be like today.
The look or the smell?
could be pretty bad. Jill, have you given thought to what you would like to own from a film?
I actually asked my husband because he is the movie buff amongst us, and he says the lightsaber from Star Wars,
Okay.
the hat or the whip from Indiana Jones, or the DeLorean from Back to the Future. I think of those three, I would go with the DeLorean.
Yes.
What about you, Moshe?
I like the DeLorean. I also like the Ark from Indiana Jones. I think that would be very cool if they can find it in that warehouse at the end. I also like the trench coat from The Fugitive.
That's so random.
So random. Hold on. Alex, my wife, is near as we record this. Al, if you could own an iconic movie item from a film, what would you want to own?
Necklace from Titanic.
The necklace from Titanic, Alex says. The Hope necklace. Good choice.
That is a very good choice. Well done on the spot, Alex.
Yes.
I love the wallpaper from Willy Wonka.
Oh, Alex has one additional item as she sits behind me as I record here. The wallpaper from Willy Wonka.
I like that. That's another
The one
good
that tastes and smells. That's good. You got some good ones, Al. I also would like a piece of the Yellow Brick Road or a portion of the Yellow Brick Road to install in a future home.
They still have that on the Sony lot in LA. The Yellow Brick Road.
I'm told by Alex it's still on the Sony lot in LA. So I might have to go conduct an operation there.
And finally, from ESPN, the men's basketball Final Four is set. UConn, Purdue, Alabama, and NC State will battle it out this upcoming weekend. The number one UConn Huskies continue to be their usual dominant selves en route to what could be a back-to-back title if they can win twice more. They first have to take on one of the most promising teams in the tournament in number 4, Alabama Crimson Tide. In the other matchup, another one seed Purdue will take on tournament underdogs NC State, the surprise team of March Madness so far. They will battle it out in Phoenix on Friday with the finals taking place next Sunday.
Yeah, NC State upsetting Duke as the 11th seed here. They are now the 7th team ever to reach the Final Four as a double-digit seed. And for the Wolfpack, first time since the early 80s that they're there. So I think there's going to be a lot of people rooting for them as the underdog here. And as far as the women's side, we see a couple schools dominating both tournaments, Jill. NC State, the Lady Wolfpack, they've also made it to the Final Four on the women's side, along with the University of South Carolina. Battling out for the final 2 spots on the women's side later today will be the University of Southern California against UConn. So again, UConn could make it to the Final Four on both the men's and the women's side. And then later tonight, probably the most anticipated matchup of the women's basketball tournament is Iowa and LSU, if that sounds familiar. That is a rematch of last year's national championship game. Tonight's game will be to get into the Final Four. This is Angel Reese versus Caitlin Clark. Remember, LSU won the championship last year. And so I know a lot of people who will be watching that game tonight.
Okay, Moshe, so you said Wolfpack, totally unrelated. It made me think of another iconic prop from a movie that I would want from The Hangover. I think the camera. Remember at the end, they look at the camera with pictures from their crazy night?
Yes.
That's a prop that I would want from a movie.
Well, feel free to message us as we think about it, Jill. I also want McLovin's driver's license from Superbad.
Yes.
Like I think that'd be a fun one as well. So we could go on and on from various films. And what's interesting is, in some cases, films are very good about keeping their props, but in some cases, they're thrown away and not thought of. Though I think in this day and age, they probably keep all that stuff these days.
Absolutely. They keep everything, want to sell it. Nothing gets thrown out.
All right, finally here, we end with On This Day in History. On this day in 1970, President Nixon signed a measure banning cigarette ads on radio and TV. Tragedy in the music world on this day in 1984, 40 years ago today, one day short of his 45th birthday, Marvin Gaye was shot and killed by his own father. He was at the peak of his career, known as the Prince of Motown, Sexual Healing, How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You, Mercy, Mercy Me. Though sadly he had a lifelong fight with his father. His father, Marvin Gaye Sr., was jealous of his success, and it would come to a tragic ending on this day in 1984. A couple tech on this day in history. 1976, 48 years ago today, Apple Computer was founded by college dropouts Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. The rest is history. And then, as I mentioned at the top, in 2004 on this day, the Google co-founders rolled out Gmail. Back then, I think many of us were still with our AOL, Yahoo email addresses. Some people still use their Yahoo and AOL email addresses, Jill. But at the time, Google was promising, 1 gigabyte of storage, just a massive amount of email storage, great searchability. I remember in the early days, you had to get an invite to Gmail. I remember getting one and, being really excited about it back in college. And now, of course, it's available to everybody. Jill, did you get an invite to Gmail back in 2004? Or were you still using your Yahoo?
I think so. I was a Hotmail person. I never had Yahoo,
Hotmail,
actually.
Yes, yes. All right, in TV history, on this day in 1979, turning 45 years old today, Nickelodeon, which of course has been in the news because of that documentary that came out recently. And we end here with a bit of music history. Fleetwood Mac released their song Don't Stop on this day in 1977. Of course, I remember it for its political history. That was the Bill Clinton 1992 campaign theme song.
That is what you would associate it with, Moshe.
On this day in 1986, New Kids on the Block released their debut studio album. It didn't do very well. In fact, got a little to no radio play, though they kept hanging tough, if you see where I'm going with it. Finally, their major breakthrough was on their third album with Step by Step. And finally, turning 35 years old today, Eternal Flame by the Bangles reached #1 on the Billboard charts on this day in 1989.
Close your eyes. Give me your hand. I mean, I remember it like it was yesterday, Moshe.
It is the eternal flame, Jill. It never goes out.
All right, everybody. Thank you for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, share this with your friends, please. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
Yes, and be on the lookout for a new episode of Mo News, the interview podcast, out in the next day. If you haven't subscribed or followed our second podcast, please do so right now, since we've gotten to the end of this podcast.
All right, bye, everyone.